Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Bastani. It's almost the weekend. We're not quite there yet, folks, but we're getting there. It's so close. Lovely weekend awaits all of us, but don't go anywhere. We've got a great show tonight, as ever. I'm joined this evening, anyway, by Stephen Methven. Stephen, how are we?
Hey, Aaron. I am great. Summer seems to have arrived, and on this beautiful summer's evening, I get to spend it with you. What more could I ask for?
Right, I was about to say precisely that, Stephen. Coming up tonight, we've got more on Trump's tariffs. There's even more bad news for the Labour Party. That's according to new research by Labour List. And Russell Brand has been charged with rape and sexual assault. Stay tuned for all of that. And of course, you are part of this conversation. Let me know what you think using the comments here on YouTube chat, or otherwise tweet at us using the hashtag Novara Live. Before we start the show tonight, we have to set something straight. This is from right-wing super sleuth and writer of the Woke Waste blog, Charlotte Gill. I can't explain how much chaos Quakers have unleashed in our political system. It's taking me a while to publish something on this because of the scale of political meddling by the Quakers over several hundred years. I'm sure it will take you quite a long time, actually. Huge amounts of money going into all sorts. Historically, I think Quakers are very cool, good people. But the modern version is like the religious equivalent of Novara Media. No mention of Quaker Oats. Disappointing, Charlotte. That's right, though. We do have to come clean. Novara Media is the shadowy force controlling Quakerism. If you want to help us unleash even more chaos in our political system as Quakers, I'm afraid no porridge will be included. And of course, support our work. Go to novaramedia.com/support. This is really key. If you want to upset and irritate and anger Charlotte Gill and people like her and see more of these outlandish takes, help us reach an even bigger audience. Go to novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description below. We want to upset these people as much as possible by doing our important work by building a new media for different politics. Politicians, the media, and ordinary people are still reeling from US President Donald Trump's new global tariff regime. But none is spinning harder than the fund managers. On Thursday, the move knocked $2.5 trillion off the US stock market, affecting almost every sector, but hitting those companies relying on overseas supply chains and manufacturing the hardest. The British stock market has been hit too, with the FTSE falling yesterday and even further today. Of course, those drops affect more than just bankers, savers, pensioners, people who've put a little into a stocks and shares ISA for a rainy day or a deposit on a house are all going to see a loss as well. And those losses could deepen even further. But on Truth Social, Donald Trump has doubled down. He posted this. To the many investors coming into the United States and investing massive amounts of money, my policies will never change. This is a great time to get rich, richer than ever before. Can you believe it? The massive sell-off of shares on both sides of the Atlantic indicates investor fears over a sustained economic downturn, with JP Morgan raising the odds of a global recession this year from 40 to 60%. So it's now probable, according to them. Donald Trump, however, is unbothered.
I think it's going very well. It was an operation, like when a patient gets operated on, and it's a big thing. I said this would exactly be the way it is. We have $6 or $7 trillion coming into our country, and we've never seen anything like it. The markets are going to boom, the stock is going to boom, the country is going to boom, and the rest of the world wants to see, is there any way they can make a deal? They've taken advantage of us for many, many years. For many years, we've been at the wrong side of the ball, and I'll tell you what, I think it's going to be unbelievable.
We've never seen anything like it before, folks. You're damn right. You're damn right. We've not seen anything like this before. And also the patient metaphor, rather interesting. Donald, sometimes when people have operations, they die. Right? They don't always survive. It's like an operation. It's like a life-saving operation. Sometimes you don't live, you die, okay? Maybe not the best metaphor. Now, Trump referred to $6 or $7 trillion flowing into the US because of the tariffs, and he's not wrong. The federal government is definitely going to see a larger tax take. This is from Bloomberg. The plan is equivalent to the largest tax increase since 1968, JP Morgan economist Michael Ferroli wrote in a note. It could add as much as 1.5% to prices this year using the Federal Reserve's preferred inflation gauge, while weighing on personal incomes and consumer spending. This impact alone could take the economy perilously close to slipping into recession for Rolly wrote. And this is before accounting for the additional hits to gross exports and to investment spending. Others are predicting that US inflation could hit 4% before the year ends. Now, Trump has said that the tax take from tariffs, which will be passed on to American consumers, will be offset by income tax cuts. This was Republican Senator Newt Gingrich setting out the president's reasoning on Fox News.
Make sure that you actually start shifting the tax burden back onto tariffs. Prior to 1913, when they passed the income tax, tariffs were the primary source of revenue for the United States for its entire first 150 years. And they raised plenty of money. Jefferson said proudly in his second inaugural, there was not a single internal revenue agent because all their money came from tariffs. So Trump is actually returning us to a very successful American model that created the biggest industrial society in the world.
Okay. Maybe stop driving cars too. Didn't do that 150 years ago, 200 years ago. Maybe that'll help as well. I don't think so. Is anybody proposing that? Maybe stop using satellites. It's the 21st century, not the 19th. So there's a plan. Increase the US federal tax take by imposing tariffs and implement income tax cuts. It's a simple plan, and it's also one that will only serve the rich. US income tax is, of course, a progressive tax, meaning that those with the greatest incomes pay the largest share of it. Between 2001 and 2020, the top 1% of earners in the US paid roughly 40% of the federal government's tax take. The next richest group pays about 20%. The poorest 50% of earners pay less than 5%. Of course, wealthy people say, look, we're paying so much tax. Well, that's because we have extraordinary wealth inequality in our societies, which means that those with the broadest shoulders bear, to some extent, the greatest weight. But it also means that income tax cuts will benefit the wealthiest more than any other group in society. Meanwhile, the weight of tariffs is not progressive. Everyone pays them on whatever is imported, from bananas and coffee to iPhones and steel products. Since there are more poor people than there are rich people, their tax take will go up, while the take from the richest will drop. And there you have it. A highly effective transfer of wealth from the poorest to the richest. Again, familiar story, isn't it? But that transfer is going to have deep global costs. China has retaliated to the US tariffs by imposing an extra 34% tariff on American-made goods. Meanwhile, Asian manufacturers like China, as well as Vietnam and Bangladesh, that saw very high US tariffs applied to their goods, will be looking to offload their products in other markets. That's created additional economic woes in Europe as they brace for a flood of discounted goods from Asia in what officials are calling, quote, an economic nightmare. In the UK, the government is still grappling with its own economic nightmare. Britain is now subject to a 10% tariff on all of its exports to the US, as well as a global 25% tariff on cars, as well as steel and aluminium. But Trump appears to think he's done us a favor.
We're talking to the Prime Minister about it, and we'll see how that turns out. We have a very good dialogue going. And I think he was very happy about how we treated them with tariffs.
We're so happy. It's only 10%. Thank you so much, Donald. Keir Starmer's spokesperson has been quick to contradict that assessment, saying the government was in fact disappointed by the tariffs. And while the Treasury has begun exploring how it might impose its own retaliatory tariffs, that's still Plan B. Treasury Minister James Murray explained the government's position on Radio 4.
We want to see the additional tariffs removed. We want to mitigate the impact that the changes will have on British businesses. I obviously, I don't want to comment on the ongoing negotiations themselves. And the reason why I don't think it's right for me to do that is because we need to give the negotiators some space to have those negotiations on our behalf and secure that deal.
I suppose, I ask because I guess a number of people will be thinking, why is Britain not doing anything or appears not to be doing anything? I may have got it wrong. And the response appears to have been, well, we're negotiating this new free trade deal, albeit a limited one, and you'll have to sort of wait and see for that to come along and you'll see what's going on. Is that Is that the shape of it? Is that the sequencing as you understand it?
I think it's also important to emphasize we keep everything on the table in terms of our response.
Right.
We reserve the right to retaliate. We won't hesitate to act in the national interest. We're continuing our engagement with businesses to ask them for their input in what a UK response would look like. But our focus is fully on getting that deal. And when the Prime Minister and others have talked to businesses have told us very clearly they don't want a trade war. They want an economic deal. That would be in their interest and the interest of the whole of the UK. So, whilst everything remains on the table and we reserve the right to retaliate, our full focus is on securing that deal.
Now, the government is currently presenting a binary, either retaliate with our own tariffs or negotiate for a carve-out, one that might cost concessions on standards when it comes to US imports. But appearing on ITV's Peston, economist Mariana Mazzucato suggested another route.
We need a coordinated strategy. The UK is way too small to think it can go it alone. And even any sort of preferential tariff it gets might not be stable because we know that President Trump is very unstable. So to think about a coordinated strategy in this time when Keir Starmer was anyway trying to reinvigorate, the kind of global dimension of Britain after Brexit. He had his Churchill moment, with Ukraine. We almost need that same kind of moment right now in terms of reacting to Trump. Not necessarily talking about trade wars and punching and retaliating, but actually looking at our partners, Europe, Canada, but also some of the BRICS countries where, we're about to have a G20 hosted by South Africa, a COP, the big climate meeting hosted by Brazil. We actually are living through a moment where some of those countries in the so-called global South are actually rising in terms of their voice of what should be happening in 21st century capitalism.
They are, but I don't think the United States is especially happy about it. Stephen, this is something I've heard from a number of places. Mark Carney kind of implied it as well. You're going to want to see a coalition of people collectively impose retaliatory tariffs on the US. Global South, that's going to be relatively straightforward. They're being hit the hardest. The rest of the G7, though, would really send a signal to Washington. What do you think will happen if there is a coordinated effort? Do you think the United Kingdom will be a part of it?
I don't, Aaron. I would be dead surprised if they were a part of it. And the reason for that is that Britain's influence, its sway in the world, is so dependent on its special relationship with the United States. And Atlanticism, that's the connection between these two nations, is a core part of our foreign policy, our economic policy, and to some extent even our domestic policy. Today, I saw that Tony Blair had been advising, Tony Blair, lapdog-in-chief of 20 years ago, advising that Keir Starmer not respond with any kind of retaliatory tariffs, whether alone or, I think, in a bloc. So, no, I think that what will happen is we will continue to try to negotiate for a deal. We may get one, but it may involve opening up our markets to products that we don't particularly want, hormone beef and chlorinated chicken and all the things you've heard of before. Or offering other kinds of concessions. There's another problem as well for Keir Starmer in trying to align himself with other blocs, with G7 countries, but Europe is another option. But aligning himself with Europe is that he's heading into a local election at the moment where he's very threatened by reform, and any move towards Europe is going to be exploited by that party against Labour's already bad position going into those local elections, as we'll talk about later in the show. So, yeah, I don't see it. I think it would be the right strategy because I think actually the impact of these tariffs, which is such a blunt instrument, really a crazy sledgehammer applied to the world economic order, which really makes no sense. It's very hard to determine what Trump's aims are here. And I think the account that you gave in the story of actually wanting to return to a kind of structure, economic structure within America domestically, where the wealthy are just a lot wealthier, and then perhaps somehow that trickles down economically in a way that we all know is a fantasy. That makes the most sense. Other things that I've heard of for example, lowering the deficit. Well, you don't really do that by slapping massive tariffs on goods from Lesotho, who got the second highest tariffs in the world next to China. Another one is to bring trading partners to the negotiating table to get the kinds of concessions that I think Keir Starmer would like to offer. that would involve like opening up regulatory frameworks for in Europe, for example, which can't just be done by individual countries. Again, what's to be negotiated with Lesotho. So this sledgehammer that's been applied really to improve the domestic economic conditions of wealthy people in the US is going to it has tipped up the world economic order. And it really is a moment then for Britain to think about whether or not Atlanticism is the correct strategy, not least of all because it may not be the most profitable one for them, as other groups put tariffs against goods from the US, find other trading partnerships. The UK is going to miss out on that. But just from a kind of domestic security point of view, the US has proved itself to be a completely unreliable partner. The US has proved itself to be at the whim of a man and his team behind that man, of whose strategy it's impossible to make any sense from the outside, except perhaps on the view that you gave, which means that actually he's prepared to throw his international trading partners, economic partners to the wolves in order to enrich the richest in his country. And that's not a reliable partner either. So yeah, I don't see it.
No, I agree with all that. And I mean, you can make the argument for tariffs on some products. You could say cars, I get it. Steel, I get it. But like you say, there are tariffs that are being placed on things like coffee. The United States cannot produce coffee. I mean, Hawaii can, Puerto Rico can, but they cannot produce coffee. And obviously people hear Vietnam, they think electronic goods or, consumer durables, but actually it's the world's largest producer of Robusta coffee. Your Nescafe is now going to be 30% more expensive if you're a working class American. It's putting tariffs on stuff it literally can't produce, which just makes zero sense to me. There is one argument quickly, Stephen, which says that by doing what they're doing, you're going to hammer the US stock market, you're going to have massive capital flight into US treasuries, which of course are a much safer bet than stocks right now. Flood into treasuries means that they will be, it'll be cheaper for the government to finance its debt effectively. The government can then refinance a ton of its debt. It can push down interest rates. Its deficit disappears overnight. What do you make of that? I mean, there's the higher tax take, which we already touched upon with regards to the deficit, but also the refinancing would help too. See, the US public debt is enormous. Do you think that's just kind of like we're trying to look at this through a lens that is far too sympathetic and, these guys aren't playing 5D chess, they're just idiots?
I mean, look, perhaps that's right. Look, I have to confess, I don't understand the economics of that well enough to be able to comment on it. But what I do know is that the costs of it are going to be so great. As you already said in that segment, that hammering of the stock market, again, is going to mean, some rich people are going to get hammered, but they'll get out. But it's going to mean like huge individual losses for small savers, people with small investments, pensions. It comes at a very, very heavy cost, not only to people who are investing in the US stock market, but in other stock markets as well around the world. So, that might be the strategy, but it's not one that I can find myself admiring very much.
Yeah, and before we go to the next story, I mean, we talked about the inflationary impacts this is going to have for the US. It's going to have deflationary impacts elsewhere, right? It's going to be a lot cheaper now if you want to buy a Japanese car in Europe, a lot cheaper. That has some upsides, some downsides. If you're working in a car dealership and you're working on commission, it's probably quite good, I am thinking quite a lot about how second-hand car dealers in the US are probably, rubbing their hands together. Nobody's going to buy a new Japanese car anytime soon. US President Donald Trump may be the face of his new tariff regime, but there are other brains behind the project. This is Peter Novara, Trump's senior counselor for trade and manufacturing, speaking to Fox News.
Tariffs are tax cuts. Tariffs are jobs. Tariffs are national security. Tariffs are great for America. Tariffs will make America great again.
Now, before entering politics during Trump's first term, Novara was a professor of economics at the University of California, Irvine. It was there that he wrote 2 books on China. In 2006, there was the Coming China Wars, where will they be fought and how they can be won. And then in 2011, he wrote Death by China, Confronting the Dragon, a global call to action. As you can tell by the titles, they don't exactly take a friendly approach to China's growing economic and political weight. In 2016, Novara served as an economic advisor in Trump's first presidential campaign. He was tapped after Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, apparently saw his books on Amazon. Months later, and with Trump in the White House, Politico published this assessment of Navarro's economic views. The most dangerous man in Trump world, how Peter Navarro could lead us into a global depression or worse. Called the most dangerous man in the world, it outlined how Navarro's protectionist economic policies could spark that depression, or maybe something even worse, and perhaps that's what we're looking at right now. So pretty prescient and ahead of time, maybe. Here's how the article describes Navarro's takes on China. Novara has adapted a legitimate debate about China's hegemonic aims into a series of alarmist tracts and films, all of which are redolent of Cold War hysteria about Moscow's international red web. Novara takes it as a given that China is a revisionist power that seeks to destroy the American labor force, evict America from East Asia, and establish a new totalitarian order. He never considers that China might have its own national interests or that its rise is hardly foreordained. With a slumping economy and massive internal corruption, Beijing faced its own host of internal problems. Instead, everywhere he looks, Navarro sees the hand of China at work, subverting American freedoms and prosperity. It's funny, isn't it? This is in 2016, 2017. China faced its own host of internal problems, including a slumping economy. These people have predicted 26 of the last 2 Chinese downturns. Anyway, it goes on to say this. Navarro uses military language to refer to China's trade policies, referring to its, quote, conquest of the world's export markets. They just produce cheaper stuff, Peter, which has vaporized literally millions of manufacturing jobs and driven down wages. Particularly disturbing is Navarro's fear-mongering about war with Beijing. China's aspirations are so insatiable, he claims, that eventually there'll be a clash over our most basic of all needs: bread, water, and air. They're coming for our air. You know what? I can believe it. Navarro's more general trade look is also pretty interesting. Politico wrote this. Navarro is the obverse of economists who somewhat euphorically believe that trade will bring about peaceful relations with other countries. And he poses the opposite problem. He's a hardline mercantilist who insists that military confrontation with some trading partners is almost inevitable. In this, he throws Economics 101 out the window. The classical economist David Ricardo offered a fundamental insight at the heart of the case for free trade, the theory of comparative advantage. He noted if one country can produce a good at a lower marginal cost than another, they can each focus on what they manufacture best for mutual gain. Exactly what is happening today. I don't quite agree with that, but there's some truth to it. Navarro will have none of this. He's a zero-sum economist who, like Trump, believes that every item not made in the US represents the theft of an American job. Navarro didn't manage to enact his global economic shake-up in Trump's first term. In 2023, following the attempted January 6th insurrection in 2021 by Trump supporters after he lost the presidential race, Navarro was convicted of contempt of Congress after refusing to comply with a subpoena. But before serving a 4-month jail term the following year, he managed to pen an important essay. In 2023, he wrote a chapter on fair trade in the neoconservative Project 2025 manifesto, Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. There, Navarro lays out pretty much the tariff policy we've just seen enacted, except he makes very clear that, once again, China is both the enemy and the target. He writes this. The Chinese Communist Party's policy goal is to propel the Chinese economy, but its broader goal is to strengthen the Communist China's defense industrial base and associated warfighting capabilities. That China unabashedly seeks to supplant America as the world's dominant economic and military power is not in dispute. Rather, it is a prominent feature of communist Chinese dictator Xi Jinping's rhetoric. Xi has promised that the deed will be done by 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the communist takeover of the mainland. I mean, Christ, communist takeover. It's their country, Peter. Communist takeover. They're Chinese. In the summer of 2024, Novara was released from prison and went straight to a Trump rally in Milwaukee.
Yes, indeed. This morning I did walk out of a federal prison in Miami. Joe Biden and his Department of Injustice put me there Tonight I'm here with you in this beautiful city of Milwaukee. I've got a very simple message for you. If they can come for me, and if they can come for Donald Trump, be careful, they will come for you.
That loyalty to Trump appears to have been repaid, with the Financial Times reporting this in February. People describe Trump as trusting Novara, referring to him as my Peter, and allowing him broad leeway over trade policy. Others describe Trump as a vessel for Navarro to be the architect of his own deeply held economic beliefs. Trump has given Navarro some ability to deal with this thing that has been a many decades-long motivating life mission, one person said. With China now facing 54% tariffs on exports to the US and retaliating with 34% levies on US goods, it looks like Peter Navarro may be about to get the trade war he's always wanted. I'm joined now by Jake Werner, director of the Quincy Institute's East Asia program. Jake, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be on.
So first things first, with Pete Navarro, he's obviously got the credentials. You know, he was a tenured university academic. He's written books. He speaks, in a manner one would associate with a prestigious economist, professor. How is he viewed by the apparatus around Washington? I just don't mean Republican people, I mean Democrats too. Is he viewed as a legitimate voice given his background? Or even prior to all of this, was he viewed with quite a lot of suspicion, say 10, 15 years ago?
10, 15 years ago, he was completely marginalized and viewed as sensationalistic, as you discussed. And if you had showed the image of the documentary based on the book Death by China, it has a picture of a dagger with Chinese currency on the handle plunging into a map of the United States and then blood everywhere. So he was really a sort of a rabble rouser doing anti-China propaganda before he was brought into the first Trump administration.
Would you define him as a crank then? Because like I say, he's been at the University of California, Irvine. Because, sometimes people are on a journey. They become more radicalized. They become obsessed with a certain policy detail. You're kind of painting him as more of a kind of Steve Bannon figure who's quite conspiratorial, whose style of politics was always more populist.
Yes, very much so. I would say he's strongly aligned with Steve Bannon.
And then additionally, what influences is he taking? Because, of course, he's coming out against people like David Ricardo, the idea of comparative advantage. This is Economics 101. This is the stuff that, first week of an economics module, or if you're an economics undergraduate, they're going to force feed you this stuff. I don't necessarily agree with it, but that's another point. So it's a pretty brave departure for somebody who's a tenured economist to take on that theory. Where is he coming from in American civil society with his views? What's the legacy and the heritage he's feeding on?
That's a good question. I don't know his journey well enough, but he's drawing on some deep-rooted currents in dissatisfaction with neoliberal globalization, with the terrible effects it did have on the American working class, and the effects of deindustrialization, and really moving in a populist direction, right? So he's using China as a scapegoat for something that is a structural feature of free market liberalization in the United States, and the effects of corporate power seeking low-wage labor that they can exploit more easily in places like China, like most prominently like China, but of course not just China, Mexico, Vietnam, or in an earlier period, South Korea or Hong Kong. These things are not about China, but China does feature kind of as the central villain for those who want to take the structural features of capitalism and put a human face on it. Very often that face is Chinese.
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, the excerpt I read a few moments ago, he was talking about them taking jobs and pushing down prices. I mean, this is genuinely what globalization and market competition is meant to do. It never claimed to be anything other than that. In terms of the Democrats, in terms of the American left, do people think there's a place for tariffs? Just generally, are there some people out there saying, you know what, I would quite like to see tariffs on steel or cars, but not everything, not everybody. What's the debate there? Because I suppose there'll be some people who think tariffs can be a good idea sometimes. There's a place for them. But obviously, the direction that Trump and Navarro are taking this whole debate, that might just now be discredited.
It's worth kind of trying to nuance it a little bit. There's a union like the steelworkers that have long supported tariffs and have vilified China as sort of a core feature of their discussion of globalization. So very much aligned with someone like Peter Navarro or Steve Bannon. There are unions like the auto workers who are in favor of the use of tariffs in a strategic way to support industrial policy, but they do not go after China in that way. They don't make China the scapegoat for everything. They say, look, if China wants to invest in the United States, that's fine. We just want people to invest in the United States using unionized workforce. And then there are like more internationalist, more left-wing voices that say, yes, there's space for industrial policy, but this is not something that should be the privilege of the United States. This is something that every country should have access to, not just the powerful countries who can break the rules of the WTO. And it's something that needs to be institutionalized at a global level as well. We need sort of a multilateral industrial policy to shape the structure of the global economy so it serves human ends, not just so that our country can get the best of other countries. And maybe it'll work for our people, but of course that's going to come at the expense that more or less pits workers in one country against workers in another country. And so internationalists on the left are very attuned to that and arguing for a different kind of globalization that might have some tariffs as a feature of industrial policy, but that doesn't cast global growth as a competition between different countries.
And what about the Democrat Party? You mentioned unions and their views on tariffs. I mean, somebody like Bernie Sanders, for instance, I suppose that there's probably a concern that because Trump is saying something, you overcompensate the other side. I can see already protests, another world is possible, get rid of the tariffs, bring back free trade. Yes. And I suspect somebody like Bernie Sanders wouldn't be daft enough to be involved in those kinds of protests. So what's the nuanced line that somebody like Sanders right now is trying to adopt? Has he said anything? Have there been responses from Democrat advisors, et cetera? What's the general temperature specifically with them rather than other bits of civil society?
More progressive Democrats will be aligned in one way or another with the union positions I just outlined, or with the more internationalist position. But I would say by and large, the main response has been just what you said, is that it's a denunciation of Donald Trump from the standpoint of, more or less from the standpoint of neoliberal presuppositions that usually they phrase it in terms of raising costs, like because inflation was so damaging for the Biden and Harris campaigns. They are, sort of opportunistically taking advantage. Like, here's a way we can hit Trump and say that he's going to cause inflation, and everyone hates inflation. But they're not doing that in a way that articulates a different approach to how the economy should work, how the American economy should work, how the global economy should work. They're just kind of saying Trump is going to cause inflation. And so I think that the party is, like, the progressive segments of the party have been engaged in rethinking the kind of free market dogmas of the last 40 years, but the kind of mainstream of the party has not, and they're still there, and that's the standpoint from which they're going to attack Trump.
And what does that mean in terms of wider public sentiment? Obviously, the American electorate, particularly Trump voters, aren't going to want to see inflation, but they're also not very happy with the last 40 years of free trade. So, if that is the battle for the next 6 months, year, establishment Democrats for returning to the status quo ante, Trump arguing for tariffs. Where does Middle America fall in all of that, do you think?
The tariffs, if the Trump administration sticks with the tariff regime they've just articulated, that's going to be extraordinarily disruptive to the American economy and will lead to a lot of discontent. And my personal concern is that will sort of create a new, short-term basis for a return to kind of corporate power and neoliberal presumptions in American politics, assuming that we don't have a more complete kind of economic meltdown that scrambles everything. But Trump really does have some basis to appeal to people who feel like we were really damaged by globalization. We lost a lot of good jobs, and of course, this wasn't only about globalization, or even primarily about globalization. It was about a broad-based assault by corporate power on organized labor in the United States starting in the 70s. But the way that is often apprehended amongst Americans is this was caused by globalization. It's because other workers are competing with our workers that we have lost out. And that basically is what won the election for Trump the first time around. And that remains a very powerful motivating force for a lot of people who otherwise might be horrified by what he's doing. So there is some, I think, some real conflict that American politics is going to have difficulty working through here. And the question, I think, the big question is kind of where the Democrats end up. Are they articulating sort of a short-term opportunistic critique of the immediate effects of Trump's policy, or are they able to articulate a vision for a deeper reform to our political economy and how that fits into the global economy that could potentially work for workers in the United States as well as workers outside the United States? And depending on where the Democrats end up, that's going to be very significant for the possibilities for the United States and the world after Trump.
Really, really interesting. I mean, I can see it now, right? Goldman Sachs executives and Democrat politicians with their placards, reverse the tariffs. I think it's a very dangerous place to be for the left, to be on the same side as those guys. And I think there's a place for tariffs. Not like this, of course, not like this. Labour List has published some new polling of the Labour Party membership, asking them how they think the government is doing. And ahead of the local elections next month, it isn't looking good for the party's councillors across the country. In the wake of deep cuts to disability and incapacity benefits, a make-it-up-as-you-go-along industrial policy, and the OECD halving the country's economic growth forecast for this year, the party faithful are beginning to lose the faith. And their anger is targeted at one cabinet minister in particular. These are the net favourability ratings for each member of the cabinet. This is amongst Labour Party members. And as you can see, most are managing to stay positive. Ed Miliband there right at the top, very popular man. Not Prime Minister Keir Starmer, though. He's at negative 12. And then there's the permanently unpopular Work and Pensions Secretary, Liz Kendall, at negative 33. But, and I think this is the most interesting one of the lot, it's Chancellor Rachel Reeves who's most despised. She has a net favourability rating of minus 40. Again, reminder, this is amongst Labour Party members, not Labour voters, not the public, Labour members, minus 40. Now, Reeves isn't just feeling the heat from her party members. Her fellow cabinet members are probably giving her the side eye too. That's because her spring statement last week dragged down the popularity of every single one of them. Not good. That's collective responsibility for you, I guess. But perhaps the most shocking polling revelation concerns where in the country Labour Party members have Keir Starmer's back. Because the answer is almost nowhere. He manages a positive net favourability only in London and the South East, as well as Wales. In most regions, though, it's looking cataclysmic. But while Rome burns, Labour's fiddling. This is from The Times. Last month, a memo by Starmer's strategy director, Paul Avendon, circulated among colleagues in Downing Street and the Cabinet Secretary, Chris Warmold, who is overseeing reforms to the machinery of government. It proposes an empowered, uninhibited executive with fewer constraints on its power and procedural demands on officials' time. Sounds decisive and interesting, but wait for it. These include a higher bar for public inquiries, for example, and a civil service that reflects Britain's class diversity, replacing the fast stream intake with a social mobility scheme. Several regulators and reams of legislation were earmarked for deletion too. How do we deal with the blob? Well, we make it more like a blob. Ahead of May's local elections, Keir Starmer has now posted this. Securing our borders, putting more cash in your pockets, don't know about that one, making our streets safer, giving better opportunities to our children, cheaper energy in our home, an NHS that is fit for the future. Labour is bringing change to Britain, vote Labour on. Let's just get to one moment. I want to keep up. I want to go through this. Securing our borders, okay, park that. Putting more cash in your pocket. My water bill just doubled, buddy. Don't know about that one. Council tax is up, energy and water is up. Yes, okay, real wage growth is outstripping inflation, but I don't think anybody actually has more cash in their pocket. I don't believe that. Making our streets safer, whatever. Giving better opportunities to our children, presumably by what? Giving nurses £50,000 worth of student debt. More opportunities, guys. You want to be a nurse? You have to be in £50,000 worth of debt. Great. Young people are really loving that. Literally not a single one of those things is happening. They're putting more money into the NHS, I'll give them that. But by the way, on that previous point, we're 50,000 nurses short. We can't, again, this is the group thing at Westminster, isn't it? We're 50,000 nurses short. Pretty much every single rota is understaffed in the NHS. We need to find more nurses. Maybe we should stop charging them tuition fees and scrap student debt for nurses. No, we can't do that. We've tried everything. Have you tried this one thing? No, we can't try that. Okay. By the way, that is true for so many intractable problems in politics. Stephen, what do you make of this polling? I mean, minus 40 for Rachel Reeves amongst Labour Party members. It kind of defies belief, doesn't it? I didn't even think that was possible.
Yeah, devastating, completely devastating, but also I think well-deserved, really, really well-deserved. And it doesn't surprise me at all that it's Labour members as opposed to the general public. I'm sure the general public doesn't think much of her either, but that it's Labour members who are feeling like this. That in that spring statement, of course, as we all know, Reeves brought forward massive swinging cuts to disability and incapacity benefits. Now, you don't join the Labour Party to see people with disabilities, people with long-term illnesses, people with incapacities being made poorer by the party that you're a member of. You don't join the Labour Party to see Tory policies like the two-child benefit cap retained, meaning that families with more than two children don't have no access to benefits for those further children. And you don't join the Labour Party to see pensioners deprived of their winter fuel allowance, some of the poorest pensioners deprived of that allowance. And these are all economic decisions that Rachel Reeves has made. I think there's also a general suspicion amongst Labour members about her fiscal rules. I think that probably amongst Labour Party members, there's a wide range of kind of economic theorizing, and certainly there'll be a number of them who will think that, in some cases, borrowing is the answer to large problems in society brought about by, more than a decade of austerity. But I think there's also another issue with Rachel Reeves in particular, but with the Labour Party in general. And I don't know if you remember this, Aaron, but Rachel Reeves had a slogan running in the run-up to the election, which was "Stability is change." Not a very inspiring slogan, but you can kind of understand it. It's sort of riffing off of the Trust mini budget. But we haven't had stability. Certainly, if you're a person who relies on benefits for reasons of disability or incapacity, you're certainly not enjoying much stability. But even for those who aren't, as you say, we've just seen our bills all go up: electricity, telecoms, water, council tax, all in a single week going up. That doesn't feel like stability. And on the other hand, people actually do want change, and we're not seeing change either. You said in the piece there about an industrial strategy that's kind of like changing on the hoof. We've gone from a sort of green industrial revolution to now swinging to a kind of international defense industrialization. But none of these things are actually, they don't seem to be happening. They don't seem to be happening anytime soon. And I think, the change that people want isn't coming, and the stability that they've been promised hasn't happened. And so you can hardly be surprised that they are turning on the Labour Party as a result.
Stability has changed. Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? I mean, what's stable is that things are getting worse. That's the thing that you can be sure of. Fascinating focus group recently about how the cost of living crisis is the cost of living forever. This is not going away. It wasn't 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. This is forever. What are politicians going to do about it? Right now, only Nigel Farage has a response, I think, from the English political class. I want to go to another poll. This is a national poll. It's a parliamentary seat projection if a general election was to be called today. This is from Find Out Now. The graphic is from Stats for Lefties on X, of course. Great account. Find Out Now. Look, they're a member of the relevant bodies and so on. They're a legitimate organisation. They're not as old and venerable as Salvation and Opinion, YouGov, etc. But they're legit. They have Reform on 326 seats, Labour on 92, the Lib Dems on 80, and quite remarkably, actually, the Tories coming fourth with just 65 seats. That is crazy. I mean, they're almost fifth. Stephen, what do you make of that? Do you think that's even plausible? I mean, a reform majority, really?
I don't know that people want a reform majority. I think people want reform where they can vote. I think actually the thought of a reform majority would probably put a lot of people who say they'll vote reform off. I think actually a reform majority would probably put a lot of people in reform off, because it's not very clear to me that what they actually want to do is govern. And indeed, that if they did govern, it would be the end of them, right? I think viewers might have seen a while ago, I interviewed the one of the co-leaders of Die Linke about the sort of small success that they had during the last general elections. And I asked about the firewall around the AfD in German politics, which is, this thing that stops any party from working with the far right. And I asked her, look, surely that just means that people can project all their fantasies onto the AfD all the time. They never actually have to see them in government, and they never actually have to see the mess they'd make of things were they in government. And I sort of feel like that's not only true about reform, but I think it's something that reform probably also knows themselves, that they're not really, you have Nigel Farage, who's obviously a very polished politician, a very established politician. But, do they have candidates for MPs behind them that can actually form a government? I mean, if you remember what happened to the Tories in 2019, they were riven by factions because they brought in a whole lot of, kind of headbangers who weren't really, at home in the established Tory party as it had been before. So, God knows what a reform government would look like. God knows whether reform actually wants it. And I certainly don't think that the people who are saying that they would vote for reform, indeed, they might vote for reform. I don't think that they would actually want to see a reform government themselves. But what do I know? That's just my take.
I mean, the fact that it's plausible, just to recap, reform on 326, it would give them technically a majority of one, while no other party gets more than 100 seats. I mean, that is a very sort of 1916 sort of, I'm trying to think of the election that was kind of crazy when you had the split within the Liberal Party. The fact that you have four parties between 40 and 100, just extraordinary. It is plausible, right? This is really key. It's plausible. Is it probable? I don't think it's probable. It's plausible. And I think you're right about that assessment with regards to actually reform don't want a majority, albeit a majority of one. I've spoken to people in reform, senior people, I can't really say because it's off the record. But, I say you guys might be governing in the middle of a debt crisis in 2029, and they go, they make a funny face. It's a serious proposition. And a reform government with a majority of one would be absolutely annihilated by the bond markets. I don't like saying that because I'm a socialist. I shouldn't care about the bond markets, but it's just a fact. Quite extraordinary. Quickly, Stephen, I was talking to a Tory journalist, actually, earlier this week. And they said, look, we still think Labour will be the biggest party in 2029. They won't have a majority. We think that Reform will pick up seats. The Lib Dems will pick up seats. The Greens, loads of independents, Gaza independents, etc. They'll all pick up seats. And that parliament from 29 to 33, 34 will just be pure chaos. And that's when we can come in and we just need a very simple message in big, bold letters, order. And I thought, you know what, that doesn't sound entirely unlikely. What's your view on that? If Labour were the largest party in 2029, but those kinds of trends unfolded, what do you think would happen next? And I think that this is the key question. What's the role of the left? Because there'll be really loud voices saying you have to push in behind the Labour Party to stop the far right. Is that necessarily the wisest move?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the Labour Party has shown the left that, it's not interested in the left. I don't see why the left should be interested in the Labour Party. The Greens have offered a sort of home to many who've been disenfranchised by the Labour Party. That's the place to go. I still hold out hopes for a left-wing party to emerge. There are always rumblings and rumours. I really hope that happens. I hope it happens soon because personally, I think there is a lot of energy for left-wing change and left-wing thinking, and there's nowhere for it to go. On the Tory strategy of order, I mean, that just sounds like stability is change. It's not a very exciting electoral policy to run on. I mean, I think it would depend very much on the circumstances the world is in at that election. I mean, that prediction so far, the world is at the moment so unpredictable. We've seen what's just happened, just yesterday or the day before, I can't remember, the night before, Wednesday night, with the tariffs. If those come through, who knows where that's going to take us. We've got sort of unresolved issue of a war in Europe where the resolution looks further away and a kind of strange alignment between the US and Russia appearing. I just don't understand how that, with that kind of certainty, you can think about an election 4 years down the road. But whatever happens with the Labour Party and what the distribution of seats amongst the various parties, I'm also not sure that the Tories calling order is going to be believable to anybody. I mean, it's only going to have been 8 years out of their complete evisceration. So, yeah, I'm not sure it would convince that many people. But it sounds like you think differently.
Order could be quite a tempting message. I don't think the Tories are the messenger for it, right? That's the point. I think, frankly, the environment will never be more favourable for a new left party. I agree with you. I think that's not changing anytime soon. We'll go on to our next story, our final story in a moment. Just a few, one super chat, one comment. We've got a comment here from Gary McGuigan, our own Gary. A big shout out to Stephen for an incredible few weeks covering for Michael. That is incredibly sweet. I noticed there's no super chat, but it's okay. It's a very
cheapskate.
Yeah, it's very important. Gary does enough self-exploitation, I think, at Novara Media to justify that. Very, very important point. You've done incredibly great work, Stephen, and we're all very grateful for it. So shout out to you, mate. Well done. I must say as well.
Yeah. Go on. Sorry. I was just going to say, no, it's been really, 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 really fun. But I'm really looking forward to Michael being back. We've all missed him so much.
You're the only person who's handsome in that lighting, Stephen. Oh. That room next door, prisoner cell block H. Everybody looks awful. But actually, I think you look nicer with that lighting than the lighting in here, which is the expensive lighting. You look great. Well, you should host a show from there next time.
Well, thanks very much. I hate this lighting, but I'll take it.
We all hate it. Don't worry about that one. Before we start this story, a warning. It contains references to sexual violence. Comedian, Christian New Age guru, and MAGA champion Russell Brand has been charged with rape. This is from The Guardian. Brand will appear in court in London on the 2nd of May, according to the London Metropolitan Police, which began investigating him in September 2023 after a range of allegations. The force said the allegations related to 4 separate women, as it appealed for anyone affected by the case to come forward. It is alleged that Brand raped a woman in 1999 in the Bournemouth area, indecently assaulted a woman in 2001 in the Westminster area of London, orally raped and sexually assaulted a woman in 2004 in Westminster, and sexually assaulted a woman in Westminster between 2004 and 2005. Speaking for the Metropolitan Police, Detective Superintendent Andy Furphy said this. The women who have made reports continue to receive support from specially trained officers. The Met's investigation remains open and detectives ask anyone who has been affected by this case or anyone who has any information to come forward and speak with the police. A CPS prosecutor, Jaswant Norwal, has made this statement in relation to the case. We carefully reviewed the evidence after a police investigation into allegations made following the broadcast of a Channel 4 documentary in September 2023. We have concluded that Russell Brand should be charged with offences including rape, sexual assault, and indecent assault. The Crown Prosecution Service reminds everyone that criminal proceedings are active and the defendant has the right to a fair trial. It is extremely important that there be no reporting, commentary, or sharing of information online which could in any way prejudice these proceedings. Now, as the CPS prosecutor said there, we can't comment on the case as it's now live. As journalists, we have to be very careful not to prejudice a fair trial. That's important. But someone who can comment on it is Russell Brand himself. He's currently believed to be in America, having moved there after being attacked, in his own words, and, quote, shut down by the British authorities. And he's now also responded to the criminal charges brought against him, posting this on Twitter.
Hello. Firstly, thank you for these incredible and overwhelming messages of support. We're very fortunate in a way to live in a time where there's so little trust in the British government. We're very fortunate, I suppose, that this is happening at a time where we know that the law has become a kind of weapon to be used against people, institutions, and sometimes entire nations that will not accept and tolerate levels of corruption that are unprecedented. I'm speaking particularly to those of you that are watching this in the UK. How do you feel about your legal system right now? How do you feel about some of the high-profile cases that are not being pursued and prosecuted? How do you feel that the Southport murders were handled? How do you feel about the government of Keir Starmer? Now, that's just sort of general context. Me, I've always told you guys that when I was young and single, before I had my wife and family, who were just out of shot over there, my beautiful children, I was a fool, man. I was a fool before I lived in the light of the Lord. I was a drug addict, a sex addict, and an imbecile. But what I never was a rapist. I've never engaged in non-consensual activity. I pray that you can see that by looking in my eyes. I want to thank all of you for your continuing support. I want to let you know that our show will be on Rumble on Monday. Thanks for your support there. And of course, I'm now going to have the opportunity to defend these charges in court, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. In the meantime, you lot, stay free. And we will be continuing to discuss this matter. Praise the Lord.
Stephen, what do you make of the response there from Russell Brand?
Well, Russell Brand is, I'm not going to comment on this case at all, but Russell Brand is a grifter. He's gone from, being the savior of the left to being a kind of pro-MAGA, evangelical, Christian, self-help, crystals guru. And like a lot of grifters, and especially grifters on the right, he's very happy to exploit in a completely cynical way the murder of those girls in Southport. Now, most people on the right exploit that for political advantage. I think Brand is the first I've now seen try to exploit it for personal advantage, which is even more sickening. I really can't say anything about this case, but I can say that I found that particular part of that comment completely disgusting.
Yeah, I have to agree. There was massive state failure with regards to the Southport killing and what preceded it, of course, with young Axel Rudakabana. But I don't really see how that relates to the claims being made against Russell Brand right now. Stephen, I've really enjoyed this. I hope you have too.
Yeah, I absolutely have, Aaron. Very, very much.
Really fun show. Apart from the fact that Donald Trump is bringing, a global breakdown of economic trade. Apart from that, everything's all good. And thanks, of course, to everyone for tuning in. Come back on Monday for another live show at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.